I remember the exact moment the words rose up in me, clear, urgent, almost physical, and then stopped just behind my teeth like they had hit a locked door. It wasn't courage that failed first, it was timing. The way a room can turn sharp without anyone raising their voice. The way your own breath suddenly sounds too loud in your head. The way you start measuring the distance between a thought and a consequence, and realize the consequence is closer. I had the warning, not the full shape of it, not the grand map of it, but the small ugly truth that mattered. The kind of truth that doesn't announce itself with certainty. It arrives as a nagging detail you can't unsee. A mismatch between what people are saying and what you can feel in the air. It arrives like a splinter under the nail. Tiny, relentless, impossible to ignore once it's there. I told myself I needed more proof. I told myself I was being dramatic. I told myself it wasn't my place to interrupt. And all of it sounded reasonable in the privacy of my own skull. But then I imagined the sentence leaving my mouth. I pictured it as a simple thing at first. A few words. A pause. Others looking up. A shift. Something adjusted. Disaster averted by a small correction, like turning the wheel a single inch before the ditch. That was the version my conscience offered me. Clean, quick, almost merciful. Then the other version arrived. The other version had faces. In it, the room didn't soften. It hardened. The air thickened around my voice like wet wool. Heads turned, not with gratitude, but with that look people give you when you step out of line without meaning to. Confusion first, then irritation, then something colder. In that version, my words didn't land as a warning. They landed as a challenge. And challenges have a way of becoming the only thing anyone can see. It's strange what fear will attach itself to. Not always to death, not always to pain. Sometimes to embarrassment. To being the one who made a scene. To being remembered as the person who spoke when no one asked them to. To the quiet punishment of being moved aside, shut out, reduced to a problem that needs managing. I could feel my throat tighten, as if my body itself had joined the argument. My tongue went heavy, my mouth dried out. The warning didn't vanish. It stayed, bright and insistent, but it began to feel impractical, like bringing a candle into a windstorm and expecting it to stay lit. I listened to the sounds around me with an attention that felt almost supernatural. The scrape of fabric, a faint clink of something metal, a chair shifting a fraction, breathing, someone clearing their throat in a way that wasn't nervous, just habitual. Someone who belonged, someone who had spoken 100 times in rooms like this and never once wondered if they'd pay for it later. And then there was me, holding something in my chest that wanted out. I kept rehearsing the words silently, like that would make them easier. I tried different openings, softer, more respectful, less accusatory, more uncertain, as if uncertainty could make the truth safer. Maybe, possibly, I'm not sure, but I hated how small those words felt, how they shrank the warning into a suggestion, how they made it sound like I was trying to protect myself more than anyone else. In my mind, I watched myself speak, and then watched the room respond. I watched my own sentence get cut off mid-air by a raised hand, by a glance, by a smile that wasn't a smile. I watched my warning become an inconvenience, something to be brushed aside so the larger machine could keep moving, because that's what it was in the end, a machine. And machines don't pause for doubts from parts that aren't meant to make decisions. I could tell myself I was being loyal. I could tell myself I was being disciplined. I could tell myself I was respecting a system that existed for a reason. But beneath all of that was a simpler truth, one I didn't want to say even inside my own head. I was afraid of being wrong, afraid of being noticed, afraid that if I spoke, I would become responsible, not just for the warning, but for everything that came after it. Afraid that the moment I opened my mouth, I would be forced to stand behind the words no matter what the room did to them. And there was another fear, quieter but heavier. The fear that if I spoke, and they ignored me, I would have to live with the sound of my own warning echoing into nothing. It's easier to carry silence when you can still pretend it might have been unnecessary, so I swallowed it. Not dramatically, not with a final decision that felt like a door slamming, just a small, cowardly choice disguised as patience. A pause that lasted a second too long, a breath taken at the wrong time. A moment missed so cleanly it almost looked intentional, and then the room moved on, as if it had already decided what my voice would have cost. So I let it, and in that moment, without saying a single word, I chose silence. The days had a rhythm that didn't invite interruption. Everything moved according to habit, voices at the same volume, steps taken at the same pace, decisions delivered in the same tone that discouraged questions before they were even formed. You learned quickly which sounds mattered and which ones were meant to fade into the background. Orders were clear, explanations were optional, doubt was private. I was close enough to see how things were decided, but far enough to understand I wasn't meant to shape them. That distance was not accidental. It was built into the structure, reinforced by the way people spoke around those above them, and the way they fell quiet when those same people entered a. Authority didn't need to raise its voice. It only needed to exist. There were rules, of course. Some written, most not. You learned the unwritten ones faster, because breaking them carried consequences no one ever described aloud. You didn't interrupt unless invited. You didn't speculate unless asked. You didn't volunteer concerns unless they came packaged as certainties. And even then, only from the right mouths. I watched how information traveled. It moved upward slowly, filtered, stripped of rough edges. By the time it reached the top, it was smooth enough to handle without gloves. Anything sharp was dulled along the way, not out of malice, but out of instinct. People learned what kind of information was welcomed and what kind created friction. Friction slowed things down. Slowness was treated like weakness. Those above us were not cruel men. That would have been easier. They were efficient, focused, convinced of the necessity of motion. They spoke in terms of momentum, cohesion, resolve, words that sounded clean and forward-facing, words that left little room for hesitation. I saw others hesitate, briefly, a pause before speaking, a glance sideways, a sentence that began strong and ended vague, but hesitation rarely survived contact with them. It dissolved under expectation. No one wanted to be the reason a meeting stretched longer than planned. No one wanted to be remembered as the person who complicated things. We all understood what was at stake, even if we pretended not to. Speaking up didn't just mean being heard, it meant being evaluated, weighed, classified. A single remark could change how you were seen, where you were placed, how often your presence was required or avoided. The system didn't punish dissent loudly. It adjusted around it, quietly, permanently. I had seen it happen before. Someone asks a question that lands wrong. Someone suggests an alternative that implies uncertainty where certainty is preferred. Nothing dramatic follows. No reprimand, no confrontation. Just a subtle shift, fewer invitations, shorter answers, a sense of being slightly out of alignment with the rest. That was enough. The environment trained you without instruction. You learned when to nod, when to stay still, when to let a thought pass through your mind without ever giving it shape. You learned that survival wasn't just about avoiding danger outside. It was about navigating the invisible boundaries inside. There were moments when the structure felt comforting, clear lines, defined roles, the assurance that someone else carried the weight of final decisions. Responsibility, after all, can be heavy. There is relief in believing it belongs to someone above you, but that relief comes at a price, because the closer you are, the more you see the seams, the small inconsistency, the assumptions left unchallenged because challenging them would require time, explanation, and the uncomfortable admission that certainty might be incomplete. You start to notice how quickly confidence fills gaps where information should be. Routine made it easier to ignore those gaps. Each day resembled the last closely enough that deviation felt unnecessary. The same reports, the same briefings, the same language repeated until it felt true simply because it was familiar. Familiarity has a way of quieting alarms. I told myself that if something were truly wrong, someone else would say something. Someone with authority. Someone whose voice carried weight by default. That belief was shared widely. It was the unspoken contract between all of us who stood just below the level where decisions hardened into orders. And yet, I could feel the tension beneath the surface. Not panic, something colder, a narrowing, as if the margin for error had thinned, though no one acknowledged it. Conversations became shorter. Questions were answered more quickly. Efficiency increased in proportion to unease. That was when the warning began to take shape in my mind, not as a declaration, but as a quiet resistance to the prevailing. It didn't fit the tone of the room. It didn't match the confidence of the voices delivering plans with practiced certainty. I noticed how easily my silence blended in, how natural it felt to remain still while others spoke. No one expected anything from me in those moments. That expectation, or lack of it, was its own kind of pressure. To speak would have meant stepping outside the role I had been assigned without ever being told. Hierarchy doesn't need to threaten you. It only needs to remind you where you stand, and I knew exactly where I stood. I stood close enough to understand what was being set in motion, but far enough to know my voice would arrive, already weakened by the distance it had to travel. I stood in a place where caution masqueraded as discipline, and silence was easily mistaken for professionalism. Each day the structure held. Each day the machine ran smoothly, and each day, the space for interruption grew smaller. By the time the moment approached, though I didn't recognize it as such yet, I already knew what speaking up would cost. That knowledge didn't come from fear alone. It came from watching how this world worked, and understanding that it worked precisely because people like me knew when to stay quiet. The warning didn't arrive all at once. It assembled itself slowly, piece by piece, in the spaces between conversations, in the margins of things said too confidently. At first, it was just discomfort, an unease I couldn't justify with a single fact. Then it became pattern, then inevitability. I argued with myself constantly, but never out loud. In my head, the debate was relentless. One voice insisted I was overreaching, mistaking intuition for insight. It reminded me of all the times fear had dressed itself up as foresight. It told me that doubt was easy, that responsibility belonged to those trained and positioned to carry it, that my role was to observe, to execute, to trust the structure that had carried us this far. The other voice was quieter, but it refused to leave. It didn't shout. It didn't dramatize. It simply repeated the same thought in different forms, like a stone dropped again and again into the same shallow water. Something here doesn't hold. I began replaying moments in my mind with unnatural precision, a phrase spoken too quickly, a pause skipped over, a decision framed as settled before it had been examined. None of it was enough on its own. Together, it formed a shape I couldn't ignore. I caught myself watching people more than listening to them, watching who spoke freely and who measured every word, watching who was interrupted and who never was, watching how confidence was rewarded, even when it rested on assumption, watching how uncertainty was treated like a contagion. Every time I considered speaking, my body reacted before my thoughts could finish. A tightening in the chest, a subtle rise in temperature, my jaw locking as if my muscles were bracing for impact. It was as though some deeper instinct understood the risk long before my mind could articulate. I imagined the act itself, leaning forward, clearing my throat, breaking the rhythm of the image felt wrong, like stepping into traffic on a signal no one else could see. I would have to interrupt certainty with possibility, momentum with caution, and there is resentment, even when it's justified. I told myself I would wait for the right moment. That lie lasted longer than I care to admit. The right moment became a moving target. Each opportunity disqualified itself for practical reasons. Someone else was speaking. Time was short. The atmosphere wasn't receptive. The matter had already been addressed, supposedly. There would be another chance. There always is, until there isn't. I began to rationalize my silence with alarming creativity. I convinced myself that voicing the concern prematurely could cause confusion, that confusion could lead to mistakes, that restraint was therefore the responsible choice. I framed my hesitation as discipline, as respect, as maturity, and yet, the warning didn't fade. It grew heavier. I started imagining the consequences in reverse. Not what would happen if I spoke, but what would happen if I didn't. Those thoughts were harder to control. They arrived uninvited, late at night, early in the morning, in the quiet seconds when no one was watching me maintain my composure. I saw outcomes without details, absence instead of presence, silence where there should have been voices. I pushed those images away, ashamed of their vagueness, afraid of how easily they attach themselves to my Fear works both ways. It warns you of danger, and then warns you of the cost of acknowledging that danger aloud. The hierarchy didn't need to remind me of my place. I carried it with me, embedded in the way I phrased thoughts even inside my own head. I rehearsed my concern as a question, then rejected it for sounding weak. I rehearsed it as a statement, then rejected it for sounding presumptuous. I tried to soften it, then worried softness would be dismissed. I tried to sharpen it, then worried sharpness would be punished. No version felt survivable. I watched others navigate the same space with practiced ease, and I envied them, not for their authority, but for their certainty, or at least their ability to perform it. Certainty shields you, doubt exposes you. There were moments, brief, dangerous moments, when I felt anger cut through. Anger at the structure, at the way responsibility was distributed unevenly, at the expectation that those closest to the risk should feel it deeply, but acknowledge it only if invited. In those moments, speaking felt not just necessary, but inevitable. Those moments never lasted. Fear is patient. It doesn't rush you. It waits until exhaustion sets in, until caution feels reasonable, until silence feels like the path of least harm. By the time the internal argument began to tire me, the warning had become part of me. Not something I was holding, but something I was carrying. Its weight was familiar, manageable, I told myself. Temporary. I hadn't decided yet. That was the comfort I clung to. The illusion that indecision was still a form of control. But with each passing hour, the silence grew heavier, not because it was loud, but because it was being rehearsed. And somewhere beneath all my careful thinking, a quieter truth was settling into place, waiting for the moment when hesitation would no longer feel like a choice at all. The moment did not announce itself. There was no sudden stillness, no dramatic pause where everything seemed to wait for me. It arrived disguised as routine, folded neatly into a sequence of actions that had already begun to move forward. Voices carried on with practiced confidence. A conclusion was spoken aloud, not as a question, but as a confirmation of something everyone seemed ready to accept. I felt it immediately, the shift from discussion to decision. Something tightened in my chest, as if my body had recognized the threshold before my mind caught up. This was it. Not the abstract "someday" I had been clinging to, but the exact point where words could still alter the path ahead. I knew it with a clarity that bordered on pain. The warning surged up again, sharper now, stripped of uncertainty. It no longer felt theoretical. It felt imminent, like standing on the edge of something and realizing the ground was already giving way. I remember the sensation in my hands. They were still, resting where they had been moments before, but they felt distant, heavy, unresponsive. My pulse seemed to migrate upward, beating somewhere near my throat. Swallowing became an effort. Breathing required intention. Someone finished speaking. There was a brief opening, a fraction of space where another voice could have entered without seeming intrusive. It was small, but it was real. I could have used it. I didn't. Instead, my mind raced through the consequences one final time, not in images now, but in sensations. The heat of attention turning toward me. The subtle recalibration of the room as I became an interruption instead of an observer. The immediate need to defend my concern against expressions that would not be hostile, but politely dismissive. The realization that once spoken, the warning would no longer belong to me. It would be judged, weighed, possibly discarded. And if it were discarded, I would still have to carry it. I felt my jaw clench, my tongue pressed against the roof of my mouth, as if bracing itself. The words hovered there, fully formed, demanding release. It was almost unbearable how close they were, how little effort it would have taken to let them fall into the open air. But fear has a physical gravity. It pulled the words back down. It whispered that the decision was already made, that speaking now would change nothing except my standing, that silence at least would preserve order, preserve cohesion, preserve me. Someone nodded. Another voice affirmed what had just been said. The room moved forward as if on cue, the momentum unmistakable. That tiny opening closed, sealed by agreement and forward motion. I felt something give way inside me, not collapse, but surrender. A quiet yielding that felt final. My body relaxed in a way that had nothing to do with relief. It was the relaxation of something letting go of resistance because it no longer believes it can win. I stared at a fixed point in front of me, afraid that if I looked up, someone might read the conflict still burning behind my eyes. I kept my expression neutral, disciplined, appropriate. No one noticed anything unusual. That was the most damning part. The order, flawed, incomplete, dangerous in ways I understood too well, was accepted without friction. It passed from voice to voice, from intention to execution, gaining weight and legitimacy with each repetition. What had begun as an idea hardened into something, and I stood there, close enough to feel its mass shift the air around me, close enough to know exactly what it ignored. The warning did not disappear. It retreated, settling somewhere deep and cold, where it would wait. But the moment for it to matter, to exist in the world beyond my own thoughts, had passed. No one asked for my input. No one looked in my direction. The machine continued to run smoothly, precisely because I had not interfered. I understood then that silence is not just the absence of speech. It is an action. And in choosing it, I felt the weight of what I had allowed begin to settle. Not as guilt yet, not as regret, but as something irreversible taking its first, quiet shape. The consequences did not arrive all at once. At first, there was only confirmation, not of failure, but of movement. The plan unfolded exactly as it had been described. Orders traveled downward. Actions followed. The machinery I had watched so closely did what it was built to do, and for a brief, dangerous moment, that gave me something like hope. Perhaps I had been wrong. Perhaps my silence would go unnoticed, not because it was cowardly, but because it had been unnecessary. That hope last. The first sign was subtle, a delay that hadn't been accounted for. A message repeated twice, then a third time, each repetition slightly altered, as if clarity were eroding in transit. No one reacted strongly. Adjustments were made, explanations offered. Nothing alarming, just the normal friction of things operating under pressure. But friction generates heat. I felt it before I understood it, a tightening in the atmosphere. Conversations grew shorter, not because there was less to say, but because saying more felt increasingly dangerous. Voices lowered. Eyes lingered on details they had previously skimmed past. I began to recognize the shape of what was happening with sickening familiarity. Each development aligned too cleanly with the warning I had swallowed. Not exactly as I had imagined, reality is never so accommodating, but close enough that denial became difficult. There were moments when I wanted to believe it was coincidence, that the outcome forming in front of us was the product of unrelated factors colliding by chance. I clung to that explanation desperately. Coincidence absolves. Pattern condemns. But the pattern held. Reports arrived stripped of emotion, as they always were. Yet something in their phrasing felt heavier. Absences appeared where names should have been. Delays stretched into silences that no one rushed to fill. When questions were asked, the answers were careful, incomplete, and delivered with a restraint that suggested more was known than shared. I watched faces change, not dramatically, not all at once. Just enough to notice. Lines deepened. Expressions hardened into something guarded. People began to avoid certain topics, certain glances. The ease that had once filled the space between us was replaced by a brittle efficiency. We did what needed to be done, but without the quiet confidence that had once accompanied motion. That was when understanding settled fully into my body, not as shock, not as horror, as recognition. This was it, not the moment of failure that had already passed, but the unfolding of its cost. The thing I had sensed but failed to name was now revealing itself, piece by piece, in ways that could not be argued with. Each confirmation felt like a weight added to something already pressing against my chest. I replayed the moment of silence endlessly, not in search of a different outcome. That fantasy had died quickly, but in search of the precise instant where intervention might have mattered. I dissected my hesitation with a cruelty I had never applied to anyone else. Every rationalization I had relied on turned hollow under scrutiny. There were days when the guilt arrived quietly, like a low-grade ache, manageable, almost ignorable. On those days, I told myself that responsibility still lay elsewhere, that my role had been too small to alter the course of events. I told myself that systems fail for reasons larger than individual voices. Those days never lasted. More often, the guilt came sharply, triggered by something trivial, a sound, a phrase, the way someone avoided my eyes when delivering an update. It struck without warning, precise and merciless. In those moments, the knowledge was unbearable. I had known enough, not everything, enough to slow things down, enough to complicate certainty, enough to force a second look, and I had chosen not to. I began to notice how often silence echoed in the aftermath, how many sentences ended unfinished, how many explanations stopped just short of saying what everyone already understood. We spoke around the loss, never directly into it, as if naming it would force us to account for our proximity to it. No one accused me. That was the worst part. There were no confrontations, no pointed questions, no moments where my silence was exposed and condemned. The absence of blame created a vacuum in which my own conscience grew louder. I became both witness and judge, replaying evidence only I possessed. Time moved forward, because it always does. The machine adjusted, recalibrated, compensated. New routines emerged to manage what had gone wrong. Efficiency returned, altered but intact. On the surface, it looked like recovery. Inside me, nothing recovered. Every confirmation of loss felt personal, even when it wasn't framed that way. Each name left unspoken carried the weight of the warning I had withheld. I began to understand that consequences are not always explosive. Sometimes they are quiet, cumulative, and irreversible. What haunted me most was not the scale of what had happened, but the simplicity of the moment when it could have been interrupted. No grand speech would have been required, no heroism, just a sentence, a pause, a willingness to absorb the discomfort of being the one who spoke when silence was easier. I had believed silence would protect me from responsibility. Instead, it bound me to it. As the days passed, the realization settled deeper. The cost was not abstract. It was measured in absence, in outcomes that would never be undone, in lives that continued elsewhere because they could not continue here. The weight of that understanding pressed down steadily, without drama, without release. And all the while, the world moved on, which meant I had to as well, carrying with me the certainty that what I feared had not been imagined, and that my silence had not been neutral. It had simply been early. Time did what it always does. It put distance between the moment and everything that followed it. Not enough to erase it, but enough to make it survivable. At least, that's what I told myself. Years passed. The world reorganized itself around what had happened, smoothing the edges, filing it into records and recollections that no longer carried urgency. People spoke of it less often. When they did, their voices were measured, neutral, professional. The event became something completed, something contained. For me, it never closed. Memory has a way of ignoring the rules of time. It doesn't arrive when invited. It doesn't soften because years have passed. It returns when you are least prepared, carrying the weight of the moment exactly as it was left. I would hear it sometimes. In the pause before someone finished a sentence. In the brief silence after a question no one answered. In the sound of my own breath. When a room went still for reasons unrelated to me, the warning would surface then, unchanged, as vivid as it had been the day I held it behind my teeth. I learned to live with it by not looking at it directly. I built routines. I stayed occupied. I told myself that memory was unreliable, that guilt had a way of exaggerating importance. I reminded myself that I had not given the order, that I had not signed anything, that my hands were clean in the ways that mattered. Those arguments worked, until they didn't, because the truth was quieter than guilt and far more persistent. I had been there. I had understood enough, and I had remained silent. No passage of time ever managed to dull that sequence. The moment replayed itself with perfect restraint. No dramatization, no added cruelty. Just the simple fact of a choice not taken, a sentence not spoken, a silence allowed to stand. Sometimes I wondered who I would have been if I had spoken. Not a hero. I never imagined that version of myself. More likely someone dismissed, sidelined, perhaps quietly resented, someone remembered briefly and forgotten. The thought used to frighten me. Now it frightened me less than the alternative, because the version of me that stayed silent did not disappear. He endured. He learned how to function with the knowledge that he had chosen comfort over disruption, safety over uncertainty. He learned how to carry a truth that could not be shared without reopening wounds no one wanted exposed. There was no redemption waiting at the end of that realization, no lesson neatly extracted, no forgiveness that arrived unprompted, only permanence. The guilt did not shout. It did not demand penance. It simply existed, steady and unyielding, woven into the way I remembered the past and the way I moved through the present. It shaped how I listened, how I hesitated, how I understood the cost of quiet compliance. I sometimes catch myself holding my breath in moments that resemble that one, moments where something feels off, where a pause lingers just long enough to invite interruption. My body reacts before my mind does. The tension returns, the old calculation begins. And every time I am reminded that the hardest part of silence is not the moment you choose it, it's living with the knowledge that you did. I don't tell this story to absolve myself. I don't tell it to warn anyone. I tell it because memory insists on being acknowledged, even when it offers no relief. Some silences fade with time. This one didn't. It settled into me, unchanged, and stayed. Quiet proof that there are moments when saying nothing is not neutral, and that once chosen, silence has a way of lasting longer than any sound ever could.